Good evening. Thank you for coming. My name is Naomi Nelson. I'm an associate university librarian and the director of the David and Rubenstein Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Duke University. It is my great pleasure this evening to introduce our inaugural Barbaralee Diamonstein-Spielvogel visiting artist, Steve Roden. This new program is part of the Rubenstein Library's broader efforts to encourage creativity around and through our collections. It enables an artist to spend an extended period of time at Duke, engaging with rare print and archival materials with the expectation that they will create new works inspired by that experience. The Visiting Artist Series is made possible through the generous support of Dr. Barbaralee Diamonstein-Spielvogel. Dr. Diamonstein-Spielvogel is a prolific author, interviewer, curator, and champion of the arts. Throughout her distinguished public career, she has been a leading advocate for the arts, and her dedication to new and creative ways of thinking is evidenced in the founding of this innovative program. We are pleased that she has chosen to place her own archives in the Rubenstein Library, and we are also pleased that she and her husband, Carl Spielvogel, are here with us this evening. Please join me in thanking them. Steve Roden is a multimedia artist based in Pasadena, California. He holds a Bachelor of Fine Arts from the Otis Arts Institute of the Parsons School of Design and a Master of Fine Arts from the Art Center College of Design. He has had numerous solo shows, including those at the Chinati Foundation in Marfa, Texas, the Henry Art Museum in Seattle, and the San Francisco Art Institute. His work is included in the permanent collections of the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the Museum of Contemporary Art in San Diego, the Blanton Museum of Art at the University of Texas, and the National Museum of Contemporary Art in Athens, among others. He has received numerous honors and awards, including grants from the California Arts Council, the Getty Foundation, and the Foundation for Contemporary Arts. He has completed residencies at the Akademie der Kunst in Berlin, Germany, as well as at the Chinati Foundation and the San Francisco Art Institute. It is appropriate that the inaugural Diamonstein-Spielvogel visiting artist has distinguished himself both through his process and through the diversity of media in which he works. His interests are nearly as far-ranging as those of the Rubenstein Library's collections themselves. Steve's mediums, ideas, processes have varied greatly over time, but his fascination with repurposing, rereading, and reconfiguring has remained consistent. He often finds inspiration in unexpected and often overlooked places. Over the next several weeks, I trust the diverse and wide-ranging collections of the Rubenstein Library will be inspiring to Steve as he begins anew the process of considering and reconsidering meaning in materials. Tonight, he will talk with us about that process and some of the works that have resulted from it. Please join me in welcoming inaugural Barbaralee Diamonstein-Spielvogel visiting artist, Steve Roden.
Thank you so much for bringing me out here. So far the experience has been incredible. Hopefully the talk will be okay. I love questions. I'm sort of a monotone speaker, so questions are great. I'd rather be conversing with you than talking at you, obviously. I wanted to start with a clip of a film. And let me see here if I can make it big. And I'm just going to show you a little bit of it. It's a silent film. It's sort of evident, I hope, in its title. Hopefully it's going to start moving. Oh, there we go. So it goes on for quite a while, so I'm going to stop it. But I thought it would be a good piece to start with in terms of the conversation between what I do and what I'm doing here. 2 years ago, I purchased 4 boxes of junk that belonged to Martha Graham. And it was basically this stuff that had no sort of value in terms of the objects as being particularly special, other than they were objects that belonged to her. And my initial interest in the boxes was that I could see one seashell on top of one of the boxes. And I thought it would be quite wonderful to take a seashell that she potentially would have put up to her ear in probably the 1930s. If I could have that shell, I would be able to hear basically the same thing. There's no technology or interface between us. But then I had all of these boxes of stuff that I had no idea what to do with. And the question was, how do I begin? Where do I begin? And I came up with this sort of ridiculous idea of, what if I just use everything that can fit inside my hand? It would determine the length of the film, it would determine my actions, and it sort of helped me make decisions. And I think it's really important in my work that the process is generally led by the material that I'm working with. I'm not a big dance fan, but the idea of watching my hand moving back and forth and sort of trying to do a consistent gesture and not basically being able to do it the same every time, felt some kind of kinship and some kind of conversation with body movement that was very different than obviously I had been thinking about it before. And so I also, like I said, I'm not really my computer and I are not really friends, let's leave it at that. But I wanted to show you some other things that I think would be comfortable in any number of archives. And some of these are things that I own, some of them are things that I just pulled from other sources. But I think they're a really interesting way of offering the kinds of tendencies or the kinds of information that I'm interested in or that I'm inspired by. This is an image of Iron Eye Cody. If you were my age, you saw him on television commercials for pollution and ecology. He also did a whole range of things. Most interesting was this book on Indian Sign Language. And as you can see in the picture, he's making the sign language for rain. And for me, the idea of the leap of faith from doing this and knowing that I'm talking about rain is a pretty profound thing. And I'm interested in those kinds of leaps of faith. I won't talk about all of these because I could talk about them forever. This is a group of a map that's a group of all of the largest mountains on Earth and the longest rivers based on scale. So it's a landscape of things that do exist, but they don't exist in this kind of proximity. And I just think it's a wonderful idea of sort of dealing with information. This is a similar one. This is something that I call, well, it's an insane bicycle ramp for a motorcycle ramp, but it's also aesthetically beautiful. And I think if something sort of connects with my own aesthetic, and it wasn't created to be aesthetic, it opens up this question of how do I respond to it? How do I think about it? Again, where is its integrity? I'm looking at it in a way that no one ever really, that wasn't its purpose, right? It had a different use. These are a number of similar things where I think the activity obviously here is quite profound and pretty incredible and completely insane. But it also, again, I think about contemporary sculpture, and I think about images like this, which is from the late 1880s, and I think about form, and I think about creative form, and where does creative form come from? Aesthetic decisions or decisions towards making some crazy machine work a certain way. Similarly, this is from World War II, someone in England, and this crazy metal contraption that he's holding allowed them to hear warplanes coming from over a mile away. And again, no technology, just a simple, sort of beautiful, weird, strange object. I'm interested in point of view quite a bit. This is the tripod that Ozu used to shoot his films. Almost all of the shots in his films were taken at the height of a person's head sitting on a tatami mat. So his tripod was very specific in terms of where he was looking and how he was looking. And again, those decisions are quite important to me. Similarly, these two photographs were made by George Nelson, who was one of the head designers at the Herman Miller Company from the 1940s to the 1970s. And he's one of my heroes, but also he wrote this article about looking at chairs from the point of view from lying on the carpet looking up at the underside of chairs. And he just felt that like no designers had ever really considered what the underside of the chair was going to look like, and that it would be important. And I think looking at so-called insignificant things are also very important to my practice. I'm interested in objects that seem mundane and have power. These are fragments of George Washington's coffin that were offered for sale at an auction. This is how I learned to draw. And what I think is very important about this is the process of building animals was a process of having parts and putting parts together, and things would be built and taken apart. Most of my work has some of that kind of idea to it, and I trace it back to this dragon, which I could actually never draw as a child. I like this kind of nether space, how the sculpture sort of determines that this is a space, but it's also open and not a space. There's sort of a moving back and forth in terms of how to define something. I get asked a lot when I do presentations about my paintings, a lot about color. I didn't study color in 6 years of, 6 years of art school. I had 1/4 of color theory. But these are the things I was looking at when I was a child. And I think when I look at these colors, and I think that they're very, very strange combination of colors, I feel like some of that came into me through my experience with these things as a child. So I thought it would be good to talk about the first body of work that I created when I got out of graduate school. I had an incredibly contentious experience in graduate school. I would say in many ways it was not for me. And so I didn't know what to do when I got out of school. And the only thing I was really excited about was I had seen this pastel by Roden in person in Paris, and I just sort of thought it was one of the most beautiful things I had ever seen in my life. And so when I decided to try to make a body of work, I think what's quite interesting about it is that instead of inventing images, I took my imagery from this part of this image, so that I was already kind of conversing with something that already existed in the world. I don't think I've ever shown these in a talk. I didn't know I had images of them. And so most of my early work in painting used text and used found things that came out of other contexts. I worked in that mode for quite a long time. It eventually became too familiar. And in 2000, I'm looking at my notes because I'm really bad with dates. in 2002, I started to translate a book by Per Lagerkvist, who's a Swedish writer. I don't speak Swedish, and I love his writing. And this book has never been translated into English, so I decided that I would translate it into English based on the sounds of the words and also my knowledge of his writing. And obviously none of it is proper, but it allowed me to do some things that I'd never really been able to do, such as write. And also, it allowed me to think about the idea of translation. And how can something go from one medium or one language into another medium or another language and still maintain some kind of connection to the original? I also did a series of drawings at that time that were, I took a text by Hermann Hesse and I bought 26 different colored pencils, and I read the text as though it was a score, sort of telling me which pencil to use to make a mark. And the purpose of this, part of it was to make an interesting drawing that would follow a process that was very different than how I knew how to make a drawing. But the other aspect of it was, this is a text that I could read in probably 2.5 minutes. And by working this way with the same text, by doing these drawings, it usually took me a couple of days. And so it changed the pace of my working process. And I mean, obviously all of these ideas and sort of the things that I'm working with are ways of sort of focusing on my process and my practice, much more so, especially at this point, more than the things that I was actually making. I was interested in the making part. I was less interested in what was made. I didn't make bad things or things that I wasn't happy with, but it was much more important that I was learning through the process of making, and that my ability to think creatively would grow continually. I'm not a big fan of consistency. And so I had this toy when I was a kid. It's the oldest thing I remember doing with pencils or drawing. And I found it at a flea market. I totally lost my mind because I hadn't thought about it since I was like 4. And I took it home, and if you use these stencils correctly, you will make this car. And if you have the whole set, you can combine cars, and you can make, I think, over 100 different cars. And I was a terrible car drawer. And so I took it home and I started to make cars, and it felt really empty, and I was incredibly disappointed. But I've been working, at this point I had already been working with sound for probably 8 years or so. And I really started to think about the idea of sampling, which was happening a lot in popular music. And the idea of taking fragments from something that already exists and recontextualize it into another environment was very exciting. It offered a combination of creativity, but also utilizing material that exists from the beginning point all the way through the end of the work. And so I started to use the stencils for each car to generate an image, but not an image of a car. And again, it sort of provoked me to make drawings in a different way, and then the result was something that felt new or different, uncontrolled in times and completely controlled at other times. But it offered me, again, another language that I didn't have in myself. I had to find it through this conversation. And through those 3 sort of projects, I really started to think more about translation and how information could determine a lot of things for me. And so I went to what I sort of still think of as the source. It was Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds. And the score for 4 minutes and 33 seconds is, depending on which score you're looking at, is generally a paragraph of text describing the first performance. So I took that text apart and use the letters to determine the lengths of lines. So A is the first letter of the alphabet. So I'd make a 1-inch line. Z is the 26th letter of the alphabet. That would make a 26-inch line. And so I followed the text, again, like as a score, laying down marks. And I'd never made a stripe painting or a painting that, I mean, this is hardly a clean striped painting, but for me, this was a very, very different kind of language. And it led to a 3-year body of work working with the phrase "the silent world," which was the title of a book by Jacques Cousteau, which had the most wonderful title and was a super boring book. But I engaged with it for such a long time because of that title. And so all of these images are built using that method, where I would use the letters to generate different options. Initially, A would mean 1 inch. By the time I was done, it could mean 1 minute. It could mean 1 move of my hand, anything, so that it could keep opening up. I think that's the most important thing for me, is not to sort of get into a comfort zone, but to get to a place where it opens up and opens out to something else. This is, I guess they're a little convoluted here, but this is from a restaurant in Hong Kong. And the different plates, the colors of the different plates were based on the different prices of the dishes. And again, I look at this and I think about how this could be a score. You know, it's an arrangement that wasn't sort of put together with any kind of thought. I mean, it was all about getting the dishes cleaned and put on the shelf. And yet, of course, there's a great correlation between these two things. And how can this thing suddenly activate this thing? And again, it's just a very strong tendency in what I do. And I've used these color-coded xylophones a ton or glockenspiels, because they already have like a visual language attached to them. So there's a specific group of colors that can always be sort of arranged in different ways depending on what you're looking at or working with. This is the Serpentine Gallery's Pavilion that was designed by Alvaro Siza. I was invited to do a performance in this space that would be site-specific, and I went back to my glockenspiels and took the architect's drawings and generated in different methods different views of the structure with different color coding. And then during the performance, there were some sort of electronic sounds that I had made, generating by actually touching the surface of the structure, but also there were 10 people who worked at the museum who were not were not musicians. And they basically, drew images of the space through sound by copying these scores, articulating the form in a different way. And I'm also very interested in sort of working with people who are novices at certain things, and I try to sort of be in this sort of similar place if I can be. There's just so much stuff here. This is interesting, I think, because it was a collaboration with my mother. My mother was not necessarily an artist. She made stuff a lot when I was a kid, stained glass and things like that. And when she started making quilts, and they were all made up of squares, I was really interested in how geometric they were and how similar her system was to my own. There were limitations that were sort of in place for her in this sort of same way. But I had never made a quilt, and I didn't understand any of that stuff. And so I gave my mom a score and had her go to the fabric shop and to cut out squares based on the mathematics of a piece of music. And of course, when she laid the whole thing down together, it didn't make sense and it didn't fit. And we had these constant conversations about how we were going to be able to resolve this, because a quilt can't be resolved in this way, that I wanted it to be resolved. And it was a great kind of negotiation because generally I make everything by myself. So all of these paintings were based on a fragment of a piece of music. I've never heard the music, but the score came out of my grandmother's garage. And so I felt that it would be important to attempt to use it. I can't play piano and I can't read musical notes except for Every Good Boy Does Fine and Face. And so I made it myself a ruler and I went through the score and I generated all these letters, and then the letters became numbers and the numbers would determine colors. And again, they mostly physical actions. So this would be, let me just look here. This must be about 2006. I know it was when I got back from when I was at Chinati, I had a kind of a crazy experience that really changed my view of certain things, particularly with the paintings. I had never made a painting looking at something outside of the painting other than notations. I'd never looked at a photograph or an object or anything in the world. And when I came back from this residency, my grandmother had passed away about maybe a year ago, and I went to her studio to try to get some of her sculpture. She was a sculptor. And I knew my cousins were going to go in there and take everything. And so I went in and I was sort of floored by this group of stones that were unfinished, and some of them were unfinished because she died, but some of them were unfinished because she didn't know where to go with them. I mean, anyone who has a studio has stuff hanging around. And I decided that I should try to make paintings looking at these objects. And again, it sort of changed everything, which was obviously the gift. And I think it sort of, again, it opened something else up. Another thing that I thought I would never do became a large part of what I'm doing. I made sculpture from the sculpture, which was really awkward and kind of interesting. I feel like, I had a conversation with a sculptor about 15 years ago, because I don't really like sculpture, and I don't feel like I can ever engage with it in a way that feels meaningful unless it's enormous and then it's architecture, or if it fits in my hand and it's an object. But when it's at this sort of, what I would say, middle scale or regular scale, a thing on a pedestal, I always felt kind of outside of it, and so I decided it would be great to try to make some sculpture at that scale and see how it would feel, how I could engage with it, where it might take me. This is a piece from, I think, maybe 4 years ago. The documentation's not very good, unfortunately. It's like 650 pieces of wood based on this, I'm going the wrong way, based on this notation by Buckminster Fuller. It was in a huge coffee table book on his work, and it was the only image that didn't have a caption. So for me, that meant it had permission. Also color coding and lots of numbers. And so me and a friend, we built this structure. It was probably twice the size of this room. There were 4 video projections and 5 sound pieces. Everything kind of quiet, but everything moving at all times. It's probably the most sort of spectacle thing I've ever done. There should be, let me see here. I think I can show you a little bit of it. I can go back to my website. Say that might be in that category. Yeah, there So this is 2010. And there should be sound. So the images that you see that are just like marker images were the projections by themselves. And then obviously in these kinds of images, that's what's projecting on top of them. If that makes sense. That should make sense. So I'd like to show you another film. Which is,
are you using the notation for the color and the sound?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, even the objects that I made the sound with, I took those colors and I found, it was really kind of amazing. I found, I mean, it was easy for certain things. I found a yellow bowl. We have a big, salad bowl. I found everything except for the red thing. I could not find a red object that was resonant in any way. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, and I was in a used bookstore and I found this book called Life at Pomona College, which is where my exhibition was, and slipped into the back of the book was a little 7-inch record in red vinyl. And it was a bunch of students talking and walking around. And it was, I mean, I don't even know how to explain how that managed to happen because it was so completely absurd. So I mean, a lot of things, I think a lot of the work comes out of things that I stumble upon. I mean, it's rare that I would sort of come up with an idea and then try to sort of follow it and to execute something as expected. It's just not the way that I work or the way that I think. I still feel like, I mean, I always call what I do as my practice or my discipline or something like that. It just feels like it's sort of a daily practice, I guess. I mean, all of my concerns, even though I work in different mediums and I'm working with different languages, there's certainly a ton of cross-pollination in terms of on the inside of everything. I mean, I certainly respond, I think the things I respond to tend to be, somewhat connected, at least within myself. So I want to show this film. I won't show the whole thing because it's like 7 minutes and it's silent. So that film was done again around the same time that I had got those stones from my grandmother's studio, and it was very interesting to kind of go through her material. Like, she had an archive of images that she used, mostly glass images of like birds and bears, and she was my grandma. She was awesome, and it was all like kind of very characteristic things that I would have expected based on what she made. And then there was a folder underneath that with some information in it and stuff, bills and other things. And there was a quote from Henry Moore, which just threw me for a gigantic loop. I mean, I was super close to my grandma, but she had written down this quote, which I don't have it with me, but it was something about how this, like, when you make sculpture out of stone, it has to come from the inside, not from the outside. And it was this very sort of profound thing coming from who it came from to me. And so it sort of made the whole process of working with this material was so interesting, because at first I didn't know what to do with it, or like how to understand it, or how to find my way through it. And then it was through all these physical actions that ended up being in this film, were all ways of trying to take something that was somewhat mundane and to try to have it feel somehow kind of magical, And I initially had a soundtrack for it, but it really over-determined the mood of the images. And I felt like all these moments where I'm like rubbing a stone on a cymbal or on a zither, that it evokes music even though you don't actually hear it. And again, I just feel like every time every body of work, there's something that happens that allows me to sort of move further and to deal with material in some way that is different than the last time. I think probably, does anyone want to ask any questions? Sure?
So, I guess I'm referencing more of the earlier stuff you're talking about, the Jacques Cousteau book title that was a really, so you put the rules on yourself. I feel like you're kind of working in that space. Are you allowed to break your rules when you decide what they are?
Yeah, I always break them.
And that like leads to something.
Yeah. I mean, for instance, I even with this film, I mean, I started it with the intention of recording sound actions. And then when I built the soundtrack and put them together, I realized that they were both much more powerful, keeping them separated. And I think it's really important to be able to have a plan and then to somehow subvert it in some way. I think there are great artists who make rule-based work that's tight and it's rigorous, and there's 47 watercolors of it, and then you finally make it, and it's sort of like, that's just a different way of using rules, I think. And I think for myself, obviously Cage was a huge influence in terms of how to make decisions. And also, I'm a really big fan of like Fluxus scores and directions that are sort of, they're directions, but there's enough wiggle room to sort of go beyond that or to pull back in some way. I mean, the only thing I try not to do is, like, if I'm in the middle of a painting and I'm not happy with it, I will not, get the brush and the color I want and go in there and fix it. And so, I trust the rules. I break the rules when I feel like I understand what I'm doing too much, and so I have to break the rule to get to the next place. I mean, I did a project in 2011. I performed 433 every day for a year, and I wrote about it every day. And part of it was a listening exercise, part of it was a writing exercise, and just to kind of see what would happen. And like by February, I just wanted to make sound. and I was like, how can I perform this piece and make sound, and intentionally, And I was just like, screw it. Today, I'm going to perform it, and I'm gonna. There's the first movement's 30 seconds, so I was lying on the bed and I scraped the carpet 30 times, And then I did the second movement, which is 100. I did 100 things and then 130 things, and you know, I performed the score really with a lot of animosity towards it. And then, you know, the next day I went back to trying to figure out another way to articulate it. But I think it's important to break the rules at times. I mean, obviously it's harder to do that with someone else's work. But I think overall, I think that I like the idea of something that seems very simple and very compact and sort of without a lot of opening in terms of, I mean, that score is very specific. But once if you do it every day, I mean, you start to have a very different kind of relation to your own ideas, as well as what the score is sort of telling you, and how I'm talking a lot when I talk to students and other people about making work and my work, and I'm constantly talking about it as a conversation. So the material has to have a voice, and I have a voice, and you know, it can be very frustrating in a way, which is of course wonderful. Sometimes I'm, you know, creative enough to make those things happen. And I mean, there are other instances. Actually, last year, I was 8 months from my first New York show, and I had just started working on these large canvases, and I called the guy who makes my stretchers, and he was like, "Really sorry, but we can't get this linen, and it's probably going to be 2.5 months before we can get you anything." And I was like, well, "What?" And I said, "Well, could you make me some canvases instead? I don't need linen. I've been using linen for over 20 years, the same linen." And he was like, "You're crazy. It's going to be totally different. It's not going to do anything you're used to." And I was like, "Well, I don't have a choice. Make me too." And this amazing thing happened was that both of these surfaces were primed with the same material, but they didn't act the same at all. And I immediately noticed the difference. And what was so great was that when I finished this body of work, and I had my LA dealer come to my studio, who I've known for almost 20 years, she walked into my studio to see this finished body of work, and she said, "Are these finished?" And I was like, "They're totally finished. They just don't have the things in my work that you expect to be there." And they weren't there because I was working on a different surface and working with a different material, and it forced me to change. And I think being open to that kind of thing is really powerful as an artist, at least, or as a human being, to be able to transcend what you know and to be able to do something that is what you do, but doesn't feel like what you do to other people, you know? And that's where I'm continually trying to get to, you know, to subvert people's expectations of what I do, so that I'm not someone who you'll always recognize, you know? I'd like to make things that I don't recognize, if possible.
It's relatively early in your residency here, but would you give us a little sneak preview of what you're discovering in the Rubenstein library? What you can see?
I mean, I think, well, I have to do another talk about that, actually. But I will say, I think I've met with 10 people already, and each time I walk into the room, and there's this large U-shaped table with some of the most incredible things I've ever seen in my life. And you know, and so it's like, how do you even begin to reconcile it as material to look at, or to I mean, thinking about using it is a whole other question, but just to be, and not only be in the room with the stuff, but to be in the room with the guardian of the stuff who knows everything about it. It's, well, I said to someone, it's like having dinner, it's like having dessert 3 meals a day. And I'm not quite sure sort of how I mean, I have some ideas about where I might want to move with it, but so far it's just been really kind of fascinating because I think there are definitely categories of things that I would think I would be less interested in. Obviously, we all have certain, sectors of things that we constantly respond to, or at least I do. And I found myself being excited about things that were formally or culturally or historically being very different than the things I thought I would gravitate towards immediately. I mean, obviously there were some things that I wanted to steal, but it was exactly what I wanted. It wasn't someone handing you a bunch of stuff that you already like and that you can sort of research its history easily and sort of have it fit into what you do. And this is very, very different. And that's sort of the best part of this for me, is that I've done that. I've gone to archives and worked with material that I specifically wanted to work with. And this is the total opposite. It's like, I don't know, I always relate these things to like normal situations, like being your first day in school and you don't know anyone else, And I'm just standing there looking around at all this stuff and I'm like, oh, you have a Clash t-shirt, I'll hang out with you, Like, how do you, make those distinctions? So it's been overwhelming, certainly, but it also feels so rich. I mean, I have tons of notes, and I'm going to revisit some things, and I still have a few people I haven't met yet. I'm fairly certain that it will not generate a single thing, but probably a fairly large body of work, which is how things have been moving anyways. But so that's sort of where that's at.
How did you kind of come to Cage, or like how did he kind of pop up into your life as someone you're looking to?
This would be a classic sort of way that I sort of engage with things. When I was in grad school, the one professor who I did get along with at one point told me that, I almost got thrown out of graduate school. So, but I was meeting with a professor who I liked, and she said, everything you're talking about seems like you would be really interested in John Cage. And I said to her, you mean the guy who makes scores for people with toothpicks who pluck cactus? Why would I want to do that? And it was like such an amazing thing, probably 6 months later, I sort of looked into him more. And I mean, the recordings of Cage are, some of them are amazing, but a lot of them, the pieces really, you need to be in the space with the performers. And some of them you need to know a little bit of background, which is not always my favorite kind of work. But if you're in it and you are at least accustomed to it, it's an incredible, beautiful experience. But it took me a while, quite a while. And then the most amazing thing was that when I did finally sort of come to the work and started to really utilize some of his ideas into my own process, he did a performance with Merce and Kasugi and David Tudor in Pasadena during the Olympics. I think it was must have been 84, 86 Olympics. I don't remember what years are the Olympics, but, and we walked into this huge concert hall in Pasadena, and everyone was wearing tuxedos, and we were probably wearing a Clash t-shirt. And we walked up to the front of the stage to look at all the crazy synthesizers and electronics. And Cage walked out of the backstage, and he came up to us and thanked us for coming to the evening and shook our hands and walked away. And it was like, it was just such an odd moment to sort of like not really engage about anything, but to actually have this weird experience that is so immensely Cagean. Yeah, and I mean, I also think that his approach to making visual works has been incredibly important for me as well. I think he's really underrated as a visual maker.
response, you refer to something that was not your favorite kind of work. Can you share with us what is your favorite type?
It's hard to say in terms of categories. Like, I don't really like consistency, but I love Wallace Berman's work, and it's full of repetition, and it's generally, very much the same, but it just kills me. So it's hard to say. I mean, I love Alfred Jensen's work, which probably makes sense with my paintings and also my interest in numbers and, things like that. I tend to shy away from things that feel resolved. I like work where there's space for me to participate as a viewer, not looking for the sort of like the punchline or something, but something that I could keep coming to, like Richard Tuttle. You see that work, and if you see it a year later, it feels different, or it makes you struggle. I mean, there's work that I didn't like when I was, younger, and now I feel like Cage, Guston, late Guston, I've loved since I was a child, and I still love it, and I'll never stop loving it, and it's just incredible. And I feel like he was one of the bravest painters ever in terms of losing friends. I mean, making work that really pissed off a lot of people. That kind of individuality. I like a lot of minor artists who are sort of out on the periphery. I did a talk with my students, 250 artists you've never heard about in art school. And it was all sort of, different kinds of artists from different eras, but who weren't part of the canon, I mean, I love the canon too, but, I like the late Bernard show that I saw that was at the Met maybe 10 years ago. I didn't think I would think much of it, and it completely floored me. I mean, his use of color and his use of, technically painting is the only thing I think have some sort of technical understanding of. I'm not trained in music. I was in a punk rock band in the 70s, and I was the singer, so I had no talent. I could scream, and I could, and so music has come to me very slow, and I would still not consider myself a musician, but I work with sound, and I do. It's hard to talk about and to sort of understand how the sound installations work, because they work in space, and they don't work in auditoriums. The work is usually very quiet, fairly subtle, and depending on where the piece comes from, just sort of depends on what I stumble over. So it just really depends. But it's a huge facet of my work, and it's I think it's really kind of wonderful to be able to move between mediums so much. I mean, I'm sure, I know people, a lot of my painting friends always sort of bugging me to stop working with sound because I'd be a better painter if I focused on painting. And those kinds of conversations come up quite a bit. I don't know that there's like the medium police. I didn't know you're only allowed to use one. But I think there's, I have to say I really view my practice as something that's quite private, and I feel like my decisions in terms of what I'm doing and how it does or does not relate to what's going on is really important, in that way that, like I mentioned my dealer coming to my dealer doesn't come to my studio when I'm working. She comes to my studio when a body of work is finished, and then she can take it or leave it. But I don't really take advice in the studio. I'm old enough to know when I'm being stubborn as well. Yeah. So, I don't know, I could show you one last thing, which is what I'm working on now, which is sort of connected to archiving. This is a collage that was made by Jack Kirby. Jack Kirby was he's dead, but he created all of the Marvel superheroes in the 1960s, the Fantastic Four, the Avengers, Captain America, the Hulk. He didn't create Spider-Man, but when I was a child, obviously I was obsessed with comic books. I hated reading. I didn't read my comic books, but I copied the pictures very poorly, very poorly. And this collage is from one of the first comic books I had as a child. And I did some research and I found this collage and I figured out where the collage imagery came from. It came from a Life magazine, and it came from an article about Jimi Hendrix. So as a child, my two heroes were Jack Kirby and Jimi Hendrix. So this piece of paper is like a collision of like my entire childhood. And you can see in his collage, he's managed to cover all the Jimi Hendrix heads that are in these pictures. And so I decided I had two interests. One was, how did he make this decision? And the other question was, why did he only use these 2 pages to generate this collage? And so I bought an old copy of the magazine, and I'm basically working through the entire magazine, using all of the material in the magazine to generate these collages. Again, as a way of like partially just wanting to explore a medium that I haven't really done much with, certainly publicly. I've been making collages for a long time privately. But also kind of how to negotiate with someone else's history and sort of how they made decisions and why didn't they use this crazy image, you know, like why didn't he think about doing something like this or that? And obviously he was working in a medium that was very specific, and certainly collages like this would not have been appropriate in the middle of the comic book, superhero comic book at that time. But it's just so kind of wonderful to be consistently in conversation with someone in a work like this. I mean, it'll take me probably a month and a half or so, and I'll be engaged with it every day, and you know, something else will come out of it, I'm sure. And so that's where it's at. Sure.
Multifaceted question. How did sound start for you?
Uh-huh.
Just for Andy? Question mark. And
What was the last part before the question mark?
yeah, just for Andy? Question mark.
Okay, I'm not sure I understand that.
I was just wondering if you are a fan of the painter Joseph Brandy.
Oh, okay, yes.
And
How did I start making music?
yes.
Well, that's a hard question. I wasn't, I didn't take piano lessons or anything like that as a child. And when we started the punk band, it was really not about the music. I mean, we were interested in the music, obviously, but it was really more about being 14 and, going to clubs and people giving you beer and being part of something that felt like an alternative to what we knew. It wasn't like we were with all the cool people, sort of all the rejects, and we felt very comfortable, and we had people to hang out with and stuff. And by starting a band, we got to play shows. We got to open for a bunch of great bands, and we got to hang out with them. But I think more than that, I mean, it really, when I left that scene, when it started to get violent, and it was bad. When I left, it was bad. And I didn't know what kind of music I wanted to listen to. I didn't know how to make music myself, And So it happened pretty slowly. I mean, I ended up buying a 4-track cassette deck, and I would just make recordings that were like really, really, really bad songs. And because I couldn't play instruments and I wasn't really invested in that kind of music, I just didn't know what to do. And but I started to, layer things and trying to do things that weren't songs, but they still were songs. And it just sort of evolved, I think. I mean, my musical taste was changing also. And I also think when I left the punk scene, I really left this kind of loud behavior behind. I mean, I really wasn't interested in even in the art world, like, it was like right after, like when I was in school, which was a bit later, everything was big. It was like spectacle, like huge, Julian Schnabel paintings with plates falling off of them. And just everything was big and loud and just not appealing to me. And so it was like I didn't want to be yelling all the time. And so I sort of started to explore, mostly with the guitar and some other things, and, start like listening to like Eno and sort of, I discovered Morton Feldman, which was like enormous. And I mean, Feldman was a very complex classical composer. His string quartet's 6 hours, and I've seen it live. And I just think when you don't have a lot of context, it's kind of great. You just go swimming and looking for things. And Dubuffet made a record in the 60s. We were talking about this yesterday. When I discovered that record in a magazine, I just freaked. I was like, an abstract painter makes music, and maybe I have some connection to that. And there was no way to hear that record. It's like incredibly rare. I mean, we were just talking about it yesterday because I just got a catalog from a rare book dealer, and there was a copy of this record in it, and it was like, I don't know, $47,000 for this record. But there was no internet, there was no museum you could go to, there was just no way to get that information. And so he wrote this beautiful text about always being a beginner and playing instruments you don't know how to play, and to really think about, it's not about technique, it's not about playing the guitar like this, and it was really, really inspiring. I mean, it was like I went in the other room and grabbed some bottles and some other junk, and I, tapped them and made recordings, and maybe 8 years ago, which would probably be like 15 years before I read that thing about that thing. It came out on CD, and I totally hated it, all of it, hated it. But it just like not being able to know it, I built it in my head, and it was totally powerful. It was like, I can't listen to this, but I want to make the thing that I've been growing in my head, and that's sort of how it started. It was like, and there was this exhibition in Europe called Broken Music, and it was they published an enormous book of vinyl that was all related to visual artists, either through covers or through actually making work. And I just was obsessed with it. And I felt like I thought there'd be a place for me, which is always a ridiculous thing to think, but it was, and so it just happened slowly. I mean, and I'm still, I just, 8 months ago, I just got rid of my entire performance rig, and I'm working with a brand new bunch of gear that I don't understand, I don't like. I feel really, it's the most stubborn material I've ever tried to work with, and I feel like, 18 years of performing, maybe 20 years of performing the same way with the same tools. I mean, it was great in a way to have the limitation of always using these. I mean, I didn't have a laptop or anything like that, but I just felt like I knew how to do it so well, and that wasn't ever the goal, right? How to engage with people publicly in an intimate way where it feels like, again, you're you're connecting with other human beings in a way that's not distanced by technical prowess or something, you know.
We have a reception out front where we can continue this conversation. Thank you, Steve, for sharing
Thank you.
your journey.
Sure. Thank you.